Welcome to Story Comic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 289. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com. And we're truly excited to have with us the internationally acclaimed artist and highly talented creator of Wolf's Head, Allan.
Hello.
Vaughn, how you doing?
I am doing good. Thank you very, very much for having me on. This is great.
So I read Wolf's Head, and I am
Thank you.
really excited to talk to you about that. And so do you want to give people a little bit of background on how you got into writing comics and creating stories, and also a little bit of your synopsis of Wolf's Head as well? Because it's a pretty interesting story.
Sure. I'll do both.
Yeah.
I'm weird, I think, with a lot of comic book creators, particularly artists, because I did not draw as a kid.
Wow.
I actually came to art very, very late in life. I didn't start till I was about 25. And a lot of that was I was very insecure, and I really felt, particularly as a kid, that artists were kind of born and not made, and that you sort of knew you were an artist from when you popped out into the world. And when you did that, you somehow, like, almost, and I mean, it's a cliche, but almost being born with like a crayon or a pencil in your hand.
Right.
And I kept that sort of the stereotype that, I couldn't do this. I mean, I drew a little bit as a kid, but it never went anywhere. And I certainly didn't grow or what have you. And I wound up working at a bookstore when I was in my, like, around 20 years old, in my early 20s. And it was an independent bookstore. And I met a lot of writers and some artists through the course of that, with like book events and whatnot. And I talked with them. And it sounds so naive now, but in talking with them, and, I'd ask them pesky questions and stuff. And because I'm nosy and I was curious. And it was dawning on me slowly but surely that, writers and artists have bad days. And it is not something that necessarily comes easy to everybody. And yeah, like, there's the Mozarts of the world that are geniuses and what have you, but a lot of people struggle. And you through trial and error, you get stronger as you do this. So you have to maintain discipline, and you have to learn, you have to have an open mind, and what have you. So I basically was starting to absorb this, and I sat down with a copy of a book called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards, sort of a legendary book, and literally started to learn to draw. And I found I liked it. And I found that her book, and I still fondly remember that book, is she has a really interesting way of helping you as a non-visual artist start to learn how to do things in a real, and it's an amazing, because it's a book. It's not like you're in her class or anything. It's a book, but she has a really intuitive way of helping you get over a lot of the insecurities and frustrations that can happen with learning to draw. So that was the starting point. And I ran into sort of a really quick quandary after that, because I was like, okay, I can draw a little bit. I'm not very good yet. And I know there's a lot I still need to learn, like anatomy and perspective and what have you. But I want to do comics, because I had a love affair for comics as a very young kid. I mean, I started getting into comics when I moved to Ottawa here, when I was around 8 years old. And comics for me were a significant escape, because my mom was not very well. She was dealing with schizophrenia. There was a lot of mental illness and poverty. And, I found comics when I moved to Ottawa through meeting friends and whatnot. And I got introduced to comic book stores, and I just fell in love with the medium. But I never thought I could do this. And when I was starting to work with Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain at the bookstore, I was like, okay, well, this book is great, but this is, I don't know how. I don't even know the vocabulary of how to do this. And what's funny is comics so often, particularly in the West, I mean, not so much in France or Japan, obviously, or anything like that, but they're so much dismissed as an art form. And to do comics well, I mean, you need to know figure drawing, you need to know like color for color work, certainly brush and ink or pen and ink work for, for inking. I mean, your perspective, color, like color and light theory and how that, interacts. Like there's just so many things you have to learn and then be able to kind of create a synthesis with. And that took time. That took a lot of time, and there were a lot of false starts and whatnot before I started to get even decent at it. And I
Mm.
mean, I look back and I probably showed my work before I was really ready for prime time. And my initial work that's out there, was pretty rough. But you learn by doing, you have to, you put it out there and you fail, you fall on your face all the time and you get stronger and you keep going. And there was something about it, and I can never quite articulate what it is about comics and about art that, despite the difficulties and the frustrations and whatnot, it didn't stop me from keeping going. And it took a long time to get to a point where I feel now like I'm a professional. Like my work, the quality of the work, I think is pretty strong. My draftsmanship is a lot better than it ever was. And, it's just, it was a fight. It was a big fight. So turning to Wolf's Head, I mean, Wolf's Head is probably my most mature work in the sense of me as an artist. Like I felt I could like handle a story like this, where
Right.
before I don't know if I could have. Um, my earlier stuff was a little bit autobiographical, though from a fictional lens, and then some kids oriented stuff. But I was still struggling. And with Wolf's Head, a lot of things sort of came together, where I felt I could do it. And the story is really, it's about a young woman named Lauren who is kind of down on her luck, and she is struggling with trying to find herself. She had decided to be a cop and realized to her horror that this is not the world that she wanted to be in, but she still wanted to help people as
Right.
sort of the most aspirational versions of what policing can be. And when she realized that wasn't it for her, she quit. But quitting meant, oh my God, like I don't have any money. I am, come from a poor background. Like, what am I going to do? And
Right.
just as she's trying to work on this stuff, it turns out that her mom, who is working just as like low paid janitor kind of work, discovered to her amazement that there is this new life form that she doesn't really understand, but this what basically turns out to be an early form of an artificial intelligence. And one of the things I really wanted to do with the story is not do a stereotype of, and it's funny because I started it before all of the contemporary stuff about AI is in the news, but I wanted to do sort of like the anti Terminator or anti even sometimes Star Trek, where it's like, oh my God, this robot is going to replace humanity and wants to kill everything. And I was like, I wanted to do a story about an AI that is a baby that's learning and growing and actually has a great deal of affection for human beings and is
Right.
sort of learning. And
So did you kind of fall in like, basically like Asimov's like three rules of robotics in a way for this AI to follow a bit?
no, I didn't do it that way because I started off with the AI. Basically, the corporation wants to use the AI as a war fighting
Right.
machine. And what they didn't really realize is that this AI has zero interest in doing that and was
Right.
already struggling against it. Um, so it's not even to a point like the Asimov three laws situation wouldn't even apply because it was designed, or the hope for was that it would be used to kill. It would be used to harm human beings through direct actions.
Right.
So it what interested me when I was sort of brainstorming the story itself was I was like, what happens when somebody, in this case a machine, but when somebody is put into a situation where they want no part of that? And what do they do when the corporation, in this case, is not willing to allow them to, find their own pathway? And a lot of the tension of the story is Lauren's sort of developing awareness that the AI actually is decent, and that it's not a trick, or her mom hasn't made a catastrophic mistake. And Lauren starts to, slowly but surely develop a lot of affection for the AI, and that affection is also reciprocated back. So,
So for those that are listening, check out the show note links to go to vonallan.com, and that's VONALLAN.com, and check out a link to the book Wolf's Head, because when we're talking about an AI and we're talking about robotics, it's not like Iron Giant or anything, or an R2D2. It's not an actual physical robot. It's almost this liquidy kind of like T1000 situation here.
yep. Yep. Now, and that was done relatively deliberately to sort of play with that because, and I debated, am I going too far? But I think it works in the context of the story fairly well, that this thing, and I mean, we'll see how far I can get with it, but it's one of the fun things was I wanted, like a baby, to have this not fully formed thing that you could really, as a reader, judge it too much, because the form of it itself is really indistinct.
Right.
So, if I had made it, well, like Iron Giant is a good example, or any type of like classic robot with hard edges or what have you, it might seem more either malevolent, or people might read into more personality, and I wanted that to be a very strongly developing aspect of the story, that what it is and what it looks like and how it manifests is sort of fluid, because it hasn't found itself yet. It's still working on this thing, with the sort of the loose idea that the corporation behind it sort of gave it these abilities that even they themselves can't quite understand how it happened. And one of the plot points of the book is the man who nominally invented it, a guy named Jeremy Hamilton, can't figure out how he did it, so he can't replicate it, and he is frustrated to no end
Right.
that he can't figure out why this thing does what it does, and not what he programmed it or thought he programmed it to do. And that's part of the fun of the story too.
So it's kind of like a ghost in the machine kind of analogy on that too as well then.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but in some ways, yeah, yeah, it is just it because it becomes more of a subplot in the series, but it's this man who is like, he's desperate to be able to recreate this thing, because he was sort of okay, fine, this stupid thing is on its own out there, okay, we're going to work to get it back, but don't worry everybody, I can replicate it. I can't. Oh my god, like what do you mean I can't? And then he's, well, we got to get that stupid thing back, and I like ripping out my hair, trying to figure out how to, I got to get this thing work, and he can't.
Right.
So it's like it's kind of fun to do, and what is an antagonist, but an antagonist who's like baffled by what happened and cannot figure out to save his life. And it's fairly existential, because he is works at a corporation. He is very high up, but he has people he still answers to, and there is sort of a running plot is that they have expectations and they want answers, and he can't answer them because he doesn't know what the hell happened.
And so, talk about the world building aspect on this. How did you? Is this something that was kind of an almost like the shape of the AI? Was this an organic experience for you as well, or did it actually? You already had an outline for for the full story arc ahead of time.
Yeah, well, the way I write, it's a little bit different. Is I tend to write, so in a way this is very contemporary. Like a lot of people, I tend to write in arcs.
Okay.
So I had a pretty good idea of broad stroke beginning, middle, end of where I wanted the story to go. Where I think I'm a little bit different, and I don't mean this in a good or bad way, is just I really like the power of sequential storytelling. So in a periodical comic form, I have a strong belief that it, I guess the technical phrase, a literary phrase would be episodic closure. Is for the
Okay.
most part, I like having something in an individual issue have a beginning, middle, and an end. So That was not as blueprinted out or clear cut for me. I didn't. So as I approach an issue, that is something I solve on an issue by issue basis. So I had broad strokes of what Lauren's situation was, what her mom's situation was, the situation with the AI, the situation with Hamilton. But I part of the fun for me with doing the story is it's not like I scripted out, like in the case of the first book, like the first collection, the first 6 issues, which is what they were of that story. Is each story, each issue rather, was sort of built as its own story with enough threads that continue to build, hopefully, so that by the end of the book or the end of issue 6, you're like, wow, that each stands on its own, but something more is developing.
Right.
And I'm always hesitant. I don't I think people sometimes will be like, well, if you start referencing titles you like, you can get pigeonholed of, oh, well, oh, that's a Silver Age thing, or oh, that's a Bronze Age thing. And it's not so much that is I like stories for me that have well, episodic closure is the best way. And I actually looked back at
Right.
people like Charles Dickens for this. Is when Dickens was writing, people forget this now, but his work was serialized.
Right.
So
It was
Pickwick Papers and
episodic.
what
Yep.
have you. Yeah, it was very episodic. And one of the concerns he had, and I did a bit of research on that, was, well, it's very similar to contemporary serialized comics. Is okay, I'm going to have this ongoing thing. I think Pickwick was like over 20 different issues. So, how do I make sure that people can jump on board on any type of issue and on top of it get something satisfying so they will hopefully come back? So, I didn't want to just look at comics. I wanted to look outside the medium of comics and go, okay, well, how have other creators in similar but different art forms, like prose or literary fiction or what have you, handle how you do episodic storytelling? And I kept coming back to Dickens because I found actually a fair amount of research actually has been done on this, where they talked about his scholars now talk about how he was working on building episodic structure with episodic closure at the same time. And it's fascinating to me. It's endlessly fascinating. And I find it very interesting that a lot of, and I don't mean to judge them because
Right.
there are advantages too, but with the so-called decompressed storytelling, that aspect, particularly with sort of modern corporate comics and like Marvel and DC and whatnot, that seems to be a bit of a lost art form compared to previous decades, where you will often pick up an issue of whatever and you're in the middle of a storyline. There's nothing to orient a new or lapsed reader to help you understand what's happening in that story. And often the story doesn't have an ending. It has things have happened and you have to buy the next issue or the next series of issues to get the resolution. That might be fine for a trade paperback or a graphic novel collection, but I think it damages somewhat, and to what degree is an arguable case, but I do think it damages how people actually interact with the form of comics. Now, that
Right.
doesn't mean, and this is why I always have to be careful, and it's a hard thing. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm arguing for, oh, every single comic that's ever done on, by anybody should be a beginning, middle, end story, and what have you. You can read them in any order. It doesn't. No, no, no. Like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is a way to build what I would call subplots. I'm not sure if that's the correct term, but like longer narrative hooks that take longer to resolve, but still give some degree of closure of a story in a particular issue.
Right.
And that Wolf Said is really my first attempt to put that into practice, to see what I can do to do that. And it's hard for me to judge it, but that is definitely part of my sort of storytelling thesis going into it. And I'm pretty happy with it, but I mean, readers will have to be the ones that, as always, have to judge this
Right.
stuff.
Where do you see the future of comics?
I think as a medium, it's very healthy. because
Mm.
I think there is something about the medium of comics. And one thing I always like to point to is that it is remarkably democratic
Mm.
as an art form. Even with something like animation, which in some ways is a sister to comics, it's very difficult to do anything but very short animations by yourself. And I mean, there
Mm.
are software tools now that are facilitating, you know, that an individual person could do more, but it's very hard. And so I think there's something about the medium of comics where if you're working traditionally, paper, pencil, ink, or markers, or something of some sort,
Right.
and with some type of way of scanning it, either with a camera or a scanner or whatever, you can put your work out there. So I'm not that worried at all, like not worried at all about the medium of comics.
Okay.
What exactly that looks like, what type of format we're talking, if we're talking print or online, and how the panel arrangements work, that's a separate issue. But comics, that sequential nature, I'm not concerned about. The industry, particularly in the West, is a completely different question. I mean, there's been so much just recently, the distribution changes with the ending of Diamond's monopoly, the
Right.
DC first breaking away, and then Marvel. I mean, not completely breaking away from Diamond, but going with Penguin Random House. Image just recently, going with Lunar. I think like it's the industry is in a great deal of flux, and part of it is if you ever look at the pricing, and I did a little essay about a decade ago now, even a bit longer, just looking at the prices of contemporary, of what were then contemporary comics, against the United States federal minimum wage, and the ability of people to purchase periodical comics, and it's incredibly unaffordable just
Right.
from that point of view. And that's not so much a critique of the prices of comics, though I think some people interpreted that. It's also a critique on how crappy wages are
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
people. They can't afford to buy literally all that much, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's still $7.25 as a federal minimum wage.
Mm.
And that's awful, for
Right.
human beings to actually live on, let alone buying things for, for pleasure or what have you. At the same time, where the industry has really diversified is libraries and, bookstores and online
Mm.
marketplaces and what have you, not to mention getting into like webtoons and different structures of how comics look, and being able to read comics on your phone or on a computer of any sort. Like that is so different than, I mean, obviously the technology is different than when I was a kid, but the idea that libraries and bookstores would be carrying comics, like I vividly remember, and I actually used to work at the Ottawa Public Library when I was a teenager. They didn't carry comics. They carried a little bit of bande dessinée, some bande dessinée, for French language kids. And there was not all that much. And I still point to Maus, Art Spiegelman's Maus,
Right.
because not so much because of the content, though that's obviously very important, but because it won a special Pulitzer Prize. And when it won the
Right.
special Pulitzer Prize, it helped put comics, wasn't the only thing, but it certainly helped put comics on the map for sort of the, the more literary, like, ooh, wait, this, I thought they were just superheroes, or, whatever stereotype you want to use. And then, I mean, certainly Jeff Smith's Bone, and, on and on and on. There's just been a transformation where there were picture books for kids, and there were obviously illustrated prose novels, but publishers like Scholastic were not doing comics,
Right.
of any format, of any type. And like that's been just a quantum shift in, not only what gets made, but where it's positioned and how kids can find them. Kids are not reliant on going into one of the 3,500 or so comic book shops. There are a lot of other places where a kid can find a comic, and that's wonderful. And I think online, particularly with platforms like webtoons, but old school web comics anyway, that that is probably going to do nothing but grow. And that is, I think, very healthy for
Right.
the art form.
What do you enjoy most about being a comic creator?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing is challenging myself often to see what will happen next.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could get like, I love learning. So one of the things I find most rewarding about the art form, broadly speaking, is like, I like learning as a writer and I like learning as an artist, like a visual artist. So not that long ago, I did a deep dive. I found there was a weakness in my work with some of the way I was approaching tones and values. And, I revamped how I was approaching color. And I was also revamped more recently. It's not so much in those issues of Wolf's Head, but how I was approaching using value to, not just like specifically like hatching and some zipatones, but I was looking at both how manga artists and then traditional, artists like Wally Wood and what have you were using it. And I tried to learn. I tried to, explore what I could do with it and how I could incorporate it into my own style. And I find that always rewarding. And the same with writing is like I've learned how, hopefully how to better approach writing a story and breaking a story and approaching it both in an episodic way and then in a more arc based way. But at the same time, like really the funnest thing is seeing how an issue is going to turn out. Like, I mean, the best example or the best way to define this is by an example. So Wolf said the first hardcover is the first 6 issues, but I'm working on issue 18 now of the ongoing series, and those are mostly on digital format. And where I'm at now, I never thought I would be just in a narrative place for Wolf's Head when I started writing issue 1. And that's a lot of fun for me is I've Lauren has gone places with the story and the situation with her mom. There is a dog that's also a main character in the story, her mom's dog, that plays a big role. And it's just the story. That's one of the things that excites me about sequential storytelling is it's a lot of fun. And I've done it to do a beginning, middle, end graphic novel that's designed as such. But sequential storytelling, figuring out, where the story is taking you is for me always exciting. It's a great deal of fun. And it's that I really think at the end of the day is like, I wrap an issue and then I'm like, geez, I got to figure out where the hell I'm going with this next, and what's going to happen, and how this is going to play out, and what are the consequences. Like I love asking questions like that,
Right.
and that is a truly exciting part of what for me makes comics. And you can, I mean, you can capture the same thing in like a novel or a film or whatever, but there's something about the pace of comics, there's something exciting about that magic of how comics go. And it's such a unique art form compared to so many others.
What I love about your work is like you really do well with just having engaging conversations between characters. Talk to us a little bit about how that process is of how you actually write dialogue for your characters.
Well, the dialogue, it's actually this is kind of funny, is one of the things I realized when I was working on Wolf's Head more so than previous work is I kind of did a breakdown. So this goes also to learning. Is I did a breakdown on both comics from like the 1960s and different eras and contemporary
Right.
comics, and I did some research to try to go like exactly how many words, captions, speech balloons, even thought balloons, how many words can you put on a an individual comic book page, like standard
Right.
format, American Canadian style, and how like what becomes too much and what doesn't, like what works, what's the happy balance. So I started from there and I made sort of detailed notes and I literally broke down every single like sort of page that I would use, like everything from a splash page to like 16 panels, I think I did, and sort of worked out, okay, like based on an overall word count, which is around 235, 240 words overall, how does that break down on a panel by panel and balloon by balloon basis? This is fascinating. Something really interesting has happened with the medium of comics. And at the
Right.
same time, it started to dawn on me that artists like Steve Ditko and even Jack Kirby to some extent were often using 9 panel pages. Like Ditko was renowned for it, and even Kirby was using 6, 7, 8, 9 panels. And there's not like
Right.
not a hard and fast rule, but they would often use a lot of panels. And that's another thing that has changed with a lot of contemporary, I mean, again, American, English language comics is a lot of comics are down to 3 or 4 panels. So less words, less panels. And then, of course, one of the big ones is the way the gutter space is defined, that wonderful space between panels that help you actually navigate comics and the sequential storytelling of this. And people like Scott McCloud have written about this quite a bit, is there's also been sort of like a weird fusion where there's so many like design things and overlapping of panels and almost the
Right.
elimination of the gutter space. I would argue in many ways the comics are a lot harder to read. So anyway, okay, so that aside, but that gave me some ballparks of what I needed to look at. So when I write, I tend to overwrite dialogue. So in the
Okay.
editing process, using all the guidelines I just spoke about, I'll tend to bring it back down. And then it's, I basically did quite a bit of research and just sort of my own affection for certain authors and whatnot of like going, it's sort of the classic. If I read out loud some of this dialogue and closed my eyes, could I tell who's talking? You don't want all the
Mm,
characters to sound
yeah.
the same. So
Right.
Lauren is a good example. Is she speaks in a particular way, but her mom has a pronounced sort of French accent, particularly when it comes to swearing. So she tends to
Yeah.
swear in French. And the two women do not, hopefully, from my point of view, do not at all sound alike. And that sort of carries on. Is Hamilton has a more I don't know if aristocratic would be the right way, but a more privileged language. So he tends to use bigger words, not very many contractions and whatnot. And I sort of played this game
Mhm.
through it all. And then, of course, the AI, because the AI is a baby and is learning, the AI actually generally speaks in musical tones. And, playing with that was sort of interesting too. So the rhythm of it becomes so the, how to say this, like the structural approach is what I've got this scene. Okay, so I've written a scene and I know how many pages I've got for this scene. So just to pick something, I've got 3 pages to do this scene because when I broke down the issue, this is what I gave it.
Right.
This is what this scene has to accomplish. This is the characters that are in this scene, and this is the thrust of what's happening. Like these are what Lauren wants to do. These are the obstacles she's trying to, whatever. So then it's trying to figure out the best way to use dialogue to get across what where she's at, what she's trying to do, who she's talking with, and their situation. And in the back of my mind, and I sort of always leave notes to myself constantly to remind me, is does the reader understand what
Mm,
I'm trying to do? Because to me, and again, this is not a right or wrong thing. Comics are art, so there's no right way or one size fits all policy. But for me, I want my comics to be very comprehensible, and I don't want
okay. Yeah.
anybody to read a scene or read an issue and go, "What? What the hell just happened? Like, who are these people and what are they doing? Like, I don't understand." So that for me is anathema unless you're doing
Right.
it very, very deliberately. Like you have a very specific point in mind. For me, there
Right.
are no rules, so it's up to individual creators to solve this or to tackle it. But that's sort of what I think about: is can I make what is the function of the scene, what am I trying to do with the story, and how does the dialogue, and I don't know. I mean, dialogue is in some ways its own art. So if you're
Mm,
asking me like, well, how do you choose? I don't know the characters. Like it sounds good to me. I try to verbalize it and make sure I read it out loud so that it has its own kind of rhythm and it doesn't sound mechanical. It sounds like an actual human being would talk. But that's probably one of the hardest things to do. Was it Cormac McCarthy? I think it was Cormac McCarthy who removed like almost all punctuation and sort of like quotation marks and what have you. So you very rarely read, I think it's Cormac McCarthy, that you very rarely read like, Bob turned to Fred and said, quote, and then, and Fred said in reply to Bob, like you don't get that. He kind of throws you in, and that can work. That can be very, with comics, it's you're always going to have the speech balloon. So it's a different thing. But I was like, I never want to lose readers. I want readers to be able to understand what I'm doing, what I'm saying. And at the end of the day, if somebody, like, my feeling is if somebody doesn't like my work, that's okay. If somebody doesn't understand my work and is baffled with it, then I failed. Then I've just miserably failed. And that'll bum me out for days, because if you like it, and if you don't like it, but you understand it, good. We're good. If you read it and you're just like, I don't understand who these characters are. I don't know, like Lauren. Okay. I don't understand what her motivation is or what she's trying to do. Like that's the worst. So I try very hard, and I'm very lucky because my wife is a professional editor, and she works for the government, but she's had a great deal of editing experience. And so she always is looking at my work and is always like, I sort of pester her with these type of details. And I could get you the issue. I don't remember it offhand, but Jim Shooter, back when he was editor-in-chief at Marvel, actually did, in a couple of his little columns, talked about, what for him, and therefore for Marvel at the time, made a good story. And it was things like, do characters have clear goals? Like, are they trying to accomplish something? What, are they failing? Like, on and on and on. And I tend to think about that type of stuff a lot too, is to make sure that goals and motivations and obstacles and whatnot are very, very clear, and not in a hopefully like didactic way, or I'm like hitting you over the head with it, but in a way that, if I've done my job right, it's very, very subtle, and the reader is oriented in a way that they're never questioning like why these things are happening, or who they're like. I always want things like that to be very, very clear, but very, very sort of intuitive as you're going through the story.
Let me ask you, Vaughn, if people want to pick up your book and read this, where's the best place they could go to right now?
For the book, for the hardcover, I mean, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, anything like that, because they have them. I mean, they never stock them deep, which is, one of the tricks about being an independent author. They are never going to have tens of thousands of them in stock or anything, but they're easy for them to reorder, and there's no problem getting it. If people are, I mean, I know it's a hardcover, it's a bit more pricey, especially as an independent, but if people are also wanting to try Wolf's Head more inexpensively and don't mind reading digital, it's easy to find on Kindle as well. And then, on top of it, there's excerpts on my website, and I have also like short stories I've done and all kinds of stuff like that too. So if you people really want to sample for free, and you just want to sort of get a sense of how I draw and how I tell stories and whatnot, there's all kinds of short stories on my website that people can take a look at too.
Good. So Vaughn, listen, when you get in volume 2 come out, you got to come back on, because you and I can literally talk for hours.
Yeah.
It is, we can talk for a long time about this, and just incredibly impressed by the fact that, as you said, you're basically a self-taught artist, and your work is amazing. So congratulations on that.
Well, I mean, that's lovely. Thank you. I mean, it's such an exciting time for comics, and that's not to say there aren't frustrations and there aren't, difficulties with it, but it is such a wonderful time for comics. And, it's, I hope people are just always reading them and always passing on, recommendations and, word of mouth, because that is the stuff is, find stuff
Right.
you love and share the love,
That's
because,
a good point.
it,
When you find something you love, you got to share it. Yeah, that's
yeah,
a great,
it's got
great
to
point.
spread like an infection, in the, and again,
Yeah,
in the best sense of the word,
yeah,
that is one of the things that I love. And I'm weird because I'll read stuff from the 1930s right to the present. Like I've got my hands
right,
on like old Fawcett comics, right to, like, translated from Japanese or Korean or what have you,
right.
or French, and it's right to the present.
That's wonderful.
Damn, that's
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
That is just so much fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Vaughn. This has been great.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Like the AI itself, for those that might be listening to this podcast, and so like look, so if you do go to like if you go to Vaughn Allen's website, it's um hey, let me timestamp this. Hey, Daddy's doing a recording. Daddy's doing an interview. I have a kid that likes to try to sneak up on me, a 6-year-old. And she just got caught because she knocked over something and I heard it.
Uh,
So
I just had my two nephews